Please welcome Nick Thompson, CEO of The Atlantic, who will be joined with the panelists, Rohit Chopra, Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Lina, Chair of the Federal Trade Commission, and Jessica Rosenworcel, Chair of the Federal Communications Commission. Please welcome the panel.
All right, greetings, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. This is an incredible honor to be on stage with these three regulators. I feel a little bit like I'm on stage. Remember that Barcelona team that had Messi, Suarez, and Neymar up front? Little bit like that. They're all incredible regulators. They're all extremely controversial. They all have lots of allies. They also have enemies. The thing that I like is that they all have some allies on the right. Rosenworcel, huge support from the Republican Senate when she was announced. Lina, J.D. Vance's favorite regulator in all of Washington. Rohit Chopra, career saved by Clarence Thomas. So, all right. So, well, there was a Supreme Court ruling where they tried to take away all his funding. Supreme Court opinion saying no, don't take away his funding was, am I wrong?
He did vote for it, yeah.
He did write the opinion, did he not? Okay. All right, let's get cracking. So the first question I want to ask you, what I want to do in this conversation is I want us all to leave with a little bit of a sense of what we've gotten done, what you've gotten done in the last 4 years, what some of the most important frameworks to understand are, and then a little bit about what you think needs to happen to set us up for this age of AI, and what you hope will happen in the next few years. But I want to start with the question, that was the question, and any of you can answer this. You all work on sort of some similar issues, individual privacy, competition, making sure everybody has access of getting online. The first question in the Harris-Trump debate was one that's relevant, which is, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Do you think on the issues of your concern, particularly the size of the tech giants, access, privacy, do you think we are better off than we were 4 years ago? Rohit, you have a small smile, bring it.
Well, I think if I compare the last decade, and I actually want to go back 40 years, it's pretty clear that a lot of the agencies, instead of actually regulating, they more were in the mind of worshiping. They got really interested in seeing how bigger could always be better. And across so many sectors of the economy, we're finding where bigger is actually exposing some real vulnerabilities. It wasn't that long ago where we saw just the inconvenience of the CrowdStrike meltdown, but actually could have been disastrous, potentially leading to problems with our electric grid, our banking system, and so much more. So what has been good is we now have focused attention from people who really are thinking about using all the tools that we have and not waiting for there to be new laws. We want there to be new laws sometimes, but we have some text in the pages of our statutes that we're putting to use. I'll give you one example. I'm really mostly a consumer protection and fair dealing regulator, but the CFPB was put very forward in an executive order on national security, protecting people's personal data from being sent to countries of concern. And we know, take the big credit reporting conglomerate Equifax. It wasn't just the CFPB and the FTC. We found out later that it was China's People's Liberation Army behind a lot of it. So we're going to be using some laws from 1970 to cover these data brokers who have been hoovering up information about all of us, and it's being sold all over the world, sometimes for some really harmful things. So I think, Nick, we have woken up to the need that tech needs to be something that combines with our personal values, not just we're going to hope for the best when we move fast and break things.
Though it is also true, is it not, that the idea that bigger is better, the large tech companies are a lot bigger than they were 4 years ago. So Lina, do you think we're better off than we were 4 years ago?
Nick, have you missed? We've sued Facebook, we've sued Amazon, we've sued Google.
I believe you've sued them all.
So I think if there's a sense that can we snap our fingers and things happen, we live in a democracy. We live in a place where there's checks and balances. We live with courts. And I think what you've seen across the board is we're willing to use those tools and go through the process. And I think we've seen some big results from that already.
The weirdest thing of the week is there's the cover of Harper's Magazine and it has a picture, I believe it should be of a regulator. It might be Lina here with a sword, and it's going through the logos of 4 of the big tech companies and the Atlantic. And no one knows why. They might have made an error and they thought it was OpenAI or Adobe, but regardless, something we will figure out down the line. I kid you not. I wish I had a graphic. All right, let's go to some specific questions. Jessica, why don't I start with you?
Oh, well, first I want to...
Oh, you want to answer the big one?
Yeah, I do. I want to say I'm an
You guys
optimist.
Okay.
I want to say that 4 years ago, we were in the pandemic. All of us saw kids sitting outside of fast food restaurants with laptops on their knees because they didn't have the internet access they needed to go to online class. We decided as a country that we are going to fix that. We have devoted more resources to ending the digital divide than at any point in our history. I think that's a positive thing, and I think that's a development that you've seen during the last 4 years. And we're still working on it. We're not done, but I am proud of the work my agency has done to help that, and also the work we've done to be data-driven in our efforts to do so, because we now map exactly where broadband is and is not in this country down to the household, so that when we do have federal dollars to help address the digital divide, they go to the right places.
So if the internet ever goes out, call her.
You sound like my kids, you know?
Lina, what is the change in the last 4 years that you feel is most positive?
Well, look, Rohit, Director Chopra mentioned a really important one relating to, activating all of the tools and authorities that Congress has given each of our agencies and making sure that we are being faithful stewards of those laws. Another key dimension of change has just been that we've learned a lot of hard lessons over the last 40 years, candidly over the last 20 years. And the Web 2.0 era unfolded in a way where enforcers were making certain assumptions that have now been tested by reality, and we've had to update those assumptions to make sure we're not just going off of theory, but are actually reflecting how the real world actually works. So, in the early 2000s, there was a sense that, well, digital markets are so fast moving and there's so much innovation, and we don't think there's going to be monopolization or market power, but even if there is, it'll be disciplined so quickly because entry can happen so quickly. A couple of decades on, we know those assumptions weren't just wrong, but they were actually the exact opposite of what we see, which is that in digital markets, you actually have significant entry barriers. We see how the reinforcing effects of data, network externalities can actually allow these markets to tip, can actually allow monopolists to really entrench and deepen their moats in ways that becomes much more difficult to fix on the back end and is much better handled through being vigilant and active on the front end. And so there's just been a real recommitment to reality, candidly, and wanting to make sure that we are using all of our tools in a way that's reflecting how markets are working in the 21st century, rather than working off of assumptions and theories that are just somewhat outdated.
Okay, so let's stick with that theory, and I want to ask you another question, because one of the most interesting things I've read and heard in the last 3 months is very much on this theme, and which is you talking about how antitrust could actually be happening at the back end through the agreement among companies to use the same pricing algorithms or the same meta algorithms. So explain this argument, which is a new argument about how price discrimination could work. So I think it's a very interesting theory about the new world we're going into.
So there are a couple of different things going on. So there have been a set of lawsuits bringing to the surface how companies may be effectively colluding through algorithms. And so you have, major lawsuits against property managers alleging that all of these landlords, through using the same algorithm, effectively may be engaging in price fixing. And it's really important that we're all clear that there's no AI exemption or algorithmic exemption to the laws on the books. And so we've seen major lawsuits filed noting that price fixing is still price fixing regardless of whether you're doing it through an algorithm or in a more old school way. The other thing that the FTC is really focused on is trying to figure out what are the next frontiers of how all of this data about each of us could be harnessed.
Used, yes.
And sometimes we talk about privacy in a bit of an abstract way, but increasingly we're seeing firms boasting about the fact that these surveillance ecosystems could be used in ways that allow companies to target each of us with a unique price based on what they know about you. So imagine, a family where a kid has a nut allergy being charged more for the granola bars without nuts, or a person being charged more for an airline ticket because the companies know that they've just had a death in the family and need to fly across the country for a funeral, right? I mean, as we see firms market some of these capacities, we want to make sure we're really understanding what's happening here and how do we make sure that we don't just wake up one day in this new world where all of this is fully baked in and we can decide as a democracy, as a society, is this where we want to go, or do we want to have some rules that prevent what data can be collected and how it can be used?
Those examples are gross, but are they illegal, right? If I own 2 CVS stores, I can charge different price of toothpaste based on one being in a wealthier zip code than the other one.
Yeah, look, you need to look at, what are the dimensions on which discrimination is happening. You're right that our current laws prohibit discrimination on some categories in some sectors, but I think it's an open question. And, our agencies generally have authorities that are framed, at least the FTC, as prohibiting deceptive practices, prohibiting unfair practices. These generally, Congress wanted them to be flexible to address business practices as they evolve.
And what's been important is that we're looking at it economy-wide, but then also deploying some specific tools by sector. So, I've spoken with some of you a lot about this. We've had personalized pricing in financial services forever, and we've had a social score for a while called FICO, and that determines the price that you pay on so many parts of your financial life, giving an incentive for sometimes you to be manipulated or coerced when someone has put inaccurate information in there or distorted that. And these are tough questions, but what's interesting is some of them were already answered. In the 50s and 60s, there were literally people who were making dossiers about all of us, including rumors about your reputation. And we basically said, why is this stuff being bought and sold about us? And we passed laws forbidding some of it. Those dossiers, which later became credit reports, are some of the same type of reports that large data intrusive companies are using as well. And personalized surveillance-based pricing is one of the ones we really need to tackle now to figure out where to draw even more lines. Because what the economists thought was that this would create all sorts, this was like magic. We could just personalize price everyone and optimize our graphs, but actually it serves also to be a tool for abuse as well.
It could be Jessica?
Yeah, I want to talk about a different dimension of surveillance. Because something that we learned at the Federal Communications Commission is a while back, our wireless carriers were making a marketplace out of where we go and what we do with our phones. That's some awfully sensitive data. Where you go and what you do is a record of who you are. And we learned that our largest wireless carriers were taking this data, selling it to an aggregator, to a skip tracing firm, and then to a bail bondsman and bounty hunters so that you could virtually look up anyone's information about where they go and what they do in the United States. So we took our old law, in this case one from 1996, and we made sure that the sections that protect consumer privacy and communications prohibited this behavior. And we fined the companies and stopped it. But it is a measure of just how much the digital age can trace where we go, what we do, what we buy, and how much we have to be nonstop vigilant to try to draw lines where we think it's inappropriate before those become markets that are harder to police.
At worst, it's this kind of thing, right? Because it's not only tracking me, but it knows everything I'm doing. It knows
I'm not wearing one.
Yeah.
Just saying what I know.
Well, in fact, those
I just
those
published mine off the
devices,
internet.
Fitness, others, we were actually able on a public website several years ago to see the running patterns of active duty service members in supposedly undisclosed locations in North Africa. And really, we used to think of data breaches as, oh, it's just like a scammer or a hacker. If you look at the very largest intrusions into our commercial companies, not just Equifax, Anthem, the Marriott, the long list, most of it is by state actors. And I think we need to start also worrying that we used to have this kind of debate about privacy undermining national security. It's sort of flipped now. And it actually feels that greater protection of personal data is now also a way to better secure our homeland. And I think that's been a big change in thinking.
You make it hard for us reporters, you know, like I rely on looking at tech executives on Strava to figure out who they're meeting with and what deals are coming. Let's talk a little bit about the age of AI, because one of the things that's coming that is so interesting to me is that because of the development of AI and the path that the AI companies have pursued, it will be very soon that you will have systems that can perfectly impersonate us, right? In fact, we already do have them. Our voices, our text, eventually our images, clones will be coming very quickly. Why don't we start with you, Jessica?
Sure.
You had a fun example, maybe 9 months ago, where you had to crack down on voice calls, cloning the voice of President Biden. What are you going to do when the same thing happens, but much more efficiently and much better the day before the election?
Well, let's roll back and describe earlier this year, a bunch of voters in New Hampshire woke up to find out President Biden was on the phone telling them not to vote in the primary election. Needless to say, it was not the president, but a voice-cloned version of the president. And it was a very clear example of just how cheap and easy it is to take the voice of a public figure and distribute fake stuff en masse. So when this happened, I turned to my colleagues very fast and said, okay, this is the early warning shot. We have got to figure out what law prevents this, because I don't want to live in a world where we don't have laws that prevent just this kind of voice cloning and fraud intended to manipulate an election. So we found in the Telephone Consumer Protection Act of 1991, there's a prohibition on artificial and pre-recorded voices. And we very quickly decided that this applied. And we fined the carrier that sent this call $2 million, the individual behind it $6 million. And we worked hand in hand with the Republican Attorney General of New Hampshire to make sure that this individual is getting prosecuted. So we sent a very clear early signal with that call. But we're going to have a lot of work to do because it's so cheap and easy to do this. And as we near the election, I think we all have to be on guard for more of this fake stuff coming our way.
There's one thing in there that you said that scared me, which is that the law comes from 1991, and I remember 1991. We all had landlines. And we didn't have a lot of deep fakes.
I think I had an AOL account and was proud of it.
The history of writing tech regulations based on, say, laws from 1934 and 1991 is imperfect, right? Or even as we have now, the 1994, right, in Section 230. How do you think through, maybe Rohit or Lina, do you have a framework for how you think about when you can use an old tech law to solve a modern problem and when you just need to have a new law?
Well, we're under a statutory command that laws don't sunset unless it's in the law. So it's still prohibited to do these things. And often it's in some ways like a little bit of a trope to say like, well, they couldn't possibly have thought of this. But they're actually solving something through the democratic process on a values-based orientation that I think gives a lot of clues about really where were the lines being drawn. Look, we would love if they amended and updated things as things were going on. It would make our lives easier, but we have the tools that we have. And all of us essentially have derivative laws from a very long time ago, often the 30s or the teens, that is a prohibition on using these types of words: unfair, deceptive, unjust. They have a very values-based orientation and a clear framework for how you condemn them. So we go through that process, and often we've had great success. Do we want more tools sometimes that help us get things through the courts quicker? Of course. Do we want there to be more certainty as to really where we can stop things? Do we want to stop harm before they happen? Of course. But I think technology, you know, I'm also I'm a financial regulator. There was lots of things that are happening today in AI that feel as magical as the launch of wire services many years ago. But the principles that protect Fedwire are some of the same ones that protect your voice and your image. So I think what you're going to hear from us is we're going to use what we got, and we're not going to pretend that we're powerless and helpless, because we saw when regulators perceive their own powerlessness, the results are catastrophic.
Do you think there should be a federal law banning the use of cloned voices in the banking system, or of AI voices like in customer service? And that seems super efficient, right? I call Chase, I'm like, God, it'd take me forever. Like a bunch of voice clones, people I could talk to, so much better.
Well, I think we sort of operate in a very discreet way. So if Chase is cloning your voice
We don't
and
want that,
saying
no,
this
no.
is Nick Thompson.
They're cloning your voice. No, I'm just kidding.
So-
They've created an AI character who is a customer service
Well, they
bot.
have that. So Bank of America's is called Erica. Many of them have names that sound like humans.
They're always female.
They're always traditionally female-sounding names. Our study, led by Yuri Meyer, did a full review of the chatbots and generative AI used in customer service. Now, look, are there certain things about those technologies that are going to open up some potentially good things? Yes. For example, maybe it can detect my preferred language really easily. Maybe that's a good thing. Most of it, though, based on where we see some of the business rationale, how can I lower my operating expenses? How can I actually get people to not have to talk to a more expensive human? And sometimes it creates incentives for doom loops where you're with the chat or with the chat bot, and then they hope you give up. So I think we're trying to make sure that, one, the chat bot, they can't tell you wrong information and blame the AI. They have to actually make sure it works. Two, if there's existing protections on the book, such as disputing a fraudulent charge, it better be able to do that, or at least get you to the right person. The CFPB is also considering a rulemaking that would at least create some balance, including a potential dial zero for a human requirement, especially for those having an urgent need or emergency.
What about in the other direction? So what if I make a Nick bot to handle all of clone my voice with 11 Labs, and I make a Nick bot to go out and sort of, not do my banking, because probably I want to deal with my banking, but like set up my dentist appointment, should there be regulations restricting that?
I don't regulate dentistry.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
But certainly, I think the value system I'd use, and I think Chair Khan has talked about this, it's a big difference when you've authorized
Right.
your voice to be used and how, versus your voice being mined and cloned and deployed.
That seems fair. Chair Khan, let me ask you a question about AI regulation, which is something I wonder about a lot. So when AI came out, a lot of the big tech companies came to Washington, and they said, please regulate us. And they wrote op-eds, and they said, please regulate us. And they held committees, they joined groups. How much of that was because of something you mentioned earlier, which is locking in your power, right? And if you can get regulations that create a real hurdle of compliance, and you need many, many lawyers to comply with the law, then a small company can't compete. To what degree has the desire for regulation actually been a desire to lock out competitors?
Well, look, every time I've sat down with founders and startups in Silicon Valley, they have this exact concern. And they're very suspicious when they see a parade of big tech CEOs come into DC and have the red carpet rolled out for them, that there is going to be a risk of regulatory capture. And it's important to remember that not all rules and regulations are created equally, right? There can be regulatory regimes that are extremely bureaucratic, that are creating red tape, and that big companies can navigate much more easily because they have all of the expensive lawyers on their team. At the FTC, you know, I have a preference for rules that are clean and simple, that are, you know, codifying bright line rules that everybody can understand, and you don't have to go hire an army of lawyers to try to navigate. So it is important to remember that not all regulations are created equal, and there are ones that can actually help level the playing field rather than create some of those distortions. You're also right that there is a risk right now. And historically, we've seen that a lot of these moments of technological inflection points have actually helped open up the market to new competition and new innovation, and sometimes breakthrough innovations. But oftentimes, those breakthroughs come from the outsiders and the disruptors that are not worrying about, oh, will this new technology cannibalize my existing revenue stream?
Yeah.
And it's the disruptors and the outsiders and the entrepreneurs that see things a different way, spot an opening in the market. You know, sometimes monopolists get lazy, right? It's like historically we've seen that. And so making sure that we have markets that are open and allow the best ideas to come in and scale up and compete on a level playing field is going to be absolutely critical. At the FTC, we've made clear that we are looking across the entire stack, from the compute and the cloud, to the models, to the data, to the underlying apps, to make sure that, especially if you have layers where we do already see some consolidation, that that's not being used to undermine or co-opt competition in a different layer. And so earlier this year, we launched an inquiry into some of these partnerships and investments that we're seeing between existing incumbents and some of these newer firms, to try to understand what's really going on here. Are there particular strings attached? Are there ways that this is going to allow for certain types of special privileges or special access or exclusion in ways that will undermine competition? And we've made clear that, you know, these markets in particular are ones where we need to make sure they're staying open and competition is allowed to actually flourish.
Where else are you seeing signs of potential anti-competitive behavior in the stack in AI?
Well, look, I think we're already seeing some of the allegations around how these models could be, you know, both scraping information from entities across the web and then maybe spitting out stuff that is competing with them or diverting
I've heard of that issue.
traffic from them. Yeah, you might be familiar with it. We've also heard a lot of concern about consolidation at the cloud level, and that's an area that could create not just competition concerns, but also real fragility concerns, right? And if you're concentrating production, especially in layers that can effectively serve as infrastructure for huge parts of the economy, for the government, we want to make sure that you don't have a lot of vulnerabilities where a single hack or a single attack is not leading systems to break down. So we've seen concerns at that layer as well.
So let's go back to something you were talking about a little bit more, which is the trade-offs, which was sort of the premise of my previous question. I'll ask any of the three of you. So I had an AI startup, and we were trying to build AI to make conversations online better, to try to lead people to positive conversations and understanding instead of toxicity. And we launched a little beta, and we didn't launch it in Europe because we couldn't figure out GDPR, right? We're like, no kids, no Europeans. Everybody else in the world is fine. And that was a function of European law, where it's a series of trade-offs, but they did make it significantly harder for small startups without lawyers. Are there any rules or regulations where you've thought this might be a good thing, but we're worried too much that it's going to create just another hurdle for little startups, and so we're not going to do it? How do you weigh those choices?
So we think about that literally all the time in terms of, I inherited, the CFPB was started after the financial crisis, so all the rules and orders were stripped from the Fed and the FTC and given to the CFPB. And it was very obvious that many of those rules were because the agencies were twisting themselves into a pretzel to accommodate the incumbents. So it's hard because there's a lot of pushback on bright line rules often. We see it everywhere that, well, what about these 13 circumstances? And I think sometimes we have to discipline ourselves that the regulatory process is going to be over-indexed on input from incumbents and way under-indexed on the voices of the people and companies that don't yet exist.
Or consumers.
Of course, and I think what we, for example, think a lot about open technologies, our open internet as a foundational driver of so much. Next month, we are finalizing rules that will set the parameters for open banking, the ability to switch in a more frictionless way, permission your data, not allow companies to form moats or make you jump through hoops to switch in the same vein that the FCC made sure that every wireless subscriber can port their number.
We take it as a given right now, but if you look at the history of the agency, when we first proposed the idea that you should be able to take your telephone number from service provider to service provider, incumbents rushed the agency because they wanted to lock all of us in.
And look at new players, it changes
But
the
there's
game.
competition for your phone business and your wireless phone business in particular as a result of that portability. And the question is, how can we export that to other markets and make it just the expectation of consumers that we have that friction-free experience, that if we don't like a service, we can pick up and walk somewhere else.
Let me ask you a question about the age of AI we're going into. So one of the presidential candidates, I can't remember which one, said they wanted to be dictator for a day. And the idea would be to come in and just sort of do whatever you want for one day. So let's say you got to be dictator for a day, and you could change any rule or any policy. You could set up a new agency that will have complete control of AI. You can give all control of AI to the FCC. What is the thing? What is the thing that you would do? What is the problem that you would solve if you had, suddenly you have the presidential pen, you have control of Congress, and you can just make one thing better?
I don't know as regulators if we ever really think through that frame. So I'm sort of making something
But you're
up,
also like
but
smart, interesting, intellectuals.
Well, I think for me, the worry I have as a law enforcer, which is primarily my job, is I really worry that we've baked into some of our statutes the concept of scienter in a place where algorithms can commit crime that is serious and people can say it wasn't me. We have to really make sure that our laws adequately capture the recklessness and all of the ways in which serious harm, fraud, and others can occur. And until we can hold individuals accountable, it won't really be sufficiently deterred. So that's just something I think about a lot when it comes to how generative AI can be used in ways to impersonate and create real experiences with actual carbon-based humans that harm them, and there's no accountability around it.
So how do you do that?
Well, we have criminal laws on the books, and I think there's got to be work, and the executive order on artificial intelligence set out some framework for thinking about how do we protect against some of these harms. And I do think there may be places where some of our criminal statutes need to be amended.
Okay. Chairwoman Khan?
So one thing that I worry about is how do we make sure we're getting the liability framework right in this area? And how do we make sure we don't have markets where bigger firms and the entities that are really designing and creating and setting the rules of the road are allowed to let some of these technologies and tools out into the wild, and the cleanup is done by enforcers and civil society who have less resources, less information, and less ability to fix the stuff on the front end. And I worry about the bad incentives that could be created when you know, allow that type of moral hazard effectively, and where liability is not being aligned with capability and control and resources. And so making sure we get that right, so we don't have a situation where civil society and enforcers and others are having to do the cleanup, and a situation where we're not creating enough deterrence in the market, because the entities that would be best positioned to prevent a lot of this harm are not, at the end of the day, carrying the ramifications.
So, okay, so the logic, massive oversimplification, but we spent the last 20 years debating it. The logic of Section 230 was essentially the platforms are not responsible for the actions that people take on them or the things that happen because of that. Do you think that logic should be flipped around, and the creators of base level large language models and base level AI should actually be responsible for what is done with their products by users?
Well, look, there probably will need to be some fine tuning, and it's hard to answer at that type of categorical level. But I don't think you should have a system where the entities that are enabling and facilitating the lawbreaking in a way that is somewhat foreseeable are, at the end of the day, totally able to walk away from the situation.
And so the risk of that, let's just stay on this because this is an extremely interesting thread. The risk of that is that you then disincentivize people to, if I'm trying to decide whether I want to do I've got a great idea for a new large language model, new generative AI system. Should I build it here? Should I build it in Saudi Arabia? You know, where should I build it? Oh my God. Somebody's going to use this thing and they're going to like make a they're going to do something bad. They're going to do something harmful. They're going to plug it into a car. It's going to crash all over the place. I don't want to be liable for that. I'll go build it in Saudi Arabia. What is the risk that you drive some of the innovation out of this country? Because the argument made with Section 230 is, okay, it's led to a bunch of bad stuff on the internet, you know, maybe twisted an election or not, but all these companies are here. Do you worry about that?
Well, look, of course you need to figure out how to thread the needle and get the incentives right. You know, we're sitting here as law enforcers, and so we are indexing more for making sure we don't have lawlessness in the marketplace because the incentives are distorted.
Yeah, Nick, let me just share. We have a lot of corollaries when it comes to science where we think about this problem. Many of you know the company Purdue Pharmaceuticals, who together with, I believe, McKinsey and Company, where I once worked, they basically knew about how their OxyContin or other drug formulations were being crushed. They knew that it was driving addiction. So there's questions. The way we analyze some of these problems is, how are you profiting? And often there's a knowledge dimension to it or a recklessness dimension to it. All of these things are important as we think about what do we want the liability framework to be, as Chair Khan said. I really do think that the original Section 230, and I've argued this for many years, was really designed for those Prodigy and CompuServe bulletin boards, but in a world of surveillance-based advertising and behavioral targeting, some of the activities may not be passive pipes, but may actively be content for which I think increasingly courts are moving toward that.
So interesting. All right, well, let's go back to the original question. Dictator Rosenworcel.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, we don't have a lot of time, and I have lots of asks and demands. You know, were you, Congress, talking to me about what authorities I want? But let me just focus on something simple with artificial intelligence, because we have done in Washington a lot of hand-wringing and pearl-clutching about artificial intelligence and what it's going to mean for our broader economy. And there's a lot to be concerned about with concentration and the lack of completeness in models and who gets a job and who gets a loan and who gets parole. We should be concerned about all of that. But I think we also have to return to first principles, and I think transparency is the most essential one. If you are talking to a bot that's acting like it's a human, it needs to disclose that fact. If you are getting a robocall using voice cloning technology, it needs to be disclosed. And if you are watching an advertisement for a political campaign that manipulates an image, that also needs to be disclosed. Because I think that baseline of transparency will allow us to understand its effect on our civic life and our economy, and also let us as viewers, voters, and citizens make informed choices.
What do you think is the worst idea circulating right now in AI regulation?
there's a big competition for that.
Well, one just final plug I'll make is it's incredibly important that these markets actually stay open. And one risk we see is that the incumbents actually may already have a leg up.
Yeah.
And that's why making sure we are allowing things like open weight models to really open up the market and allow entrepreneurs and startups to have even a foothold in the market is going to be really important, rather than doubling down on rules or regulations that protect the incumbents.
So that's kind of a plug for Facebook there at the end. Chairman Khan?
Well, look, we need to also remember that we've seen historically companies engage in a bait and switch, right? Where they'll have openness in the beginning, try to gain scale that way, create reliance and dependence, and then be able to flip the switch. And so we need to stay vigilant.
All right. Transparency, shifting liability concerns, open competition, a lot of great hopes for the age of AI. We're out of time. They're all doing amazing work, and they're wonderful to speak with on this panel. Thank you.